Nike stock is being bought up right now after it's been down, right? Like the trends have been down for Nike, but now they're getting investment from big names. Big names are buying into Nike.
What happens when being the most dominant player on the court suddenly isn't enough anymore? When trophies, MVPs, and championships stop guaranteeing attention, influence, or even respect? Because in today's basketball world, performance is only half the equation. The other half is something far more unpredictable: culture. And that's where everything started to shift. Over the last year, something strange began showing up in the data. NBA players, athletes with access to every shoe, every signature line, every piece of cutting-edge tech imaginable, started choosing one name again and again. Not a long-time NBA legend, not a reigning finals MVP, but a rookie from the WNBA whose signature shoe technically didn't even exist yet. Caitlin Clark. Her play-exclusive sneakers weren't just popular, they were everywhere, showing up on national TV, filling highlight reels, selling out almost instantly whenever they touched retail. According to industry trackers, they became some of the most worn basketball shoes in the entire league. And that's when people inside the sneaker world started asking uncomfortable questions. Because while Clark's shoes were flying off shelves, another name was quietly struggling to keep up. A'ja Wilson. Wilson had everything brands usually want: championships, MVPs, Olympic gold, a resume that screams face of the league. She even had what Clark didn't: an actual signature shoe already on the market. Full rollout, marketing support, wide availability. On paper, it should have been untouchable. But the market doesn't care about paper. Reports began circulating online that Wilson's shoe wasn't moving the way Nike expected. Retailers allegedly saw slow turnover. Fans noticed constant restocks. Meanwhile, Clark's player exclusives were selling out in minutes and reselling for double or triple the price. Sneaker forums lit up. Social media took sides. And suddenly, a narrative began forming, not confirmed, but impossible to ignore. Was Nike quietly changing course? Nike. Rumors suggested internal priorities were shifting. Marketing attention was being redirected. Budgets were being reconsidered. And behind closed doors, executives were reportedly looking at one brutal truth: cultural pull was outperforming accolades. What made things even more tense was how differently both players handled the spotlight. One stayed mostly silent, letting performance and popularity speak. The other became increasingly vocal, publicly questioning recognition, media coverage, and motives. And that contrast, fair or not, changed how people perceived everything. Because this story isn't really about shoes. It's about how power works in modern sports. It's about why visibility can outweigh dominance, and why one quiet rise forced a billion-dollar brand to rethink its entire strategy. And what happened next is where things really got uncomfortable. The first real warning sign didn't come from a press release or a headline. It came from the court. Night after night, NBA players stepped onto the floor wearing the same shoe, not because they were paid to, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The Kobe 5 and Kobe 6 player exclusives tied to Caitlin Clark started showing up everywhere, during nationally televised games, playoff runs, even high-pressure moments when performance matters most. That detail is critical. Professional athletes are ruthless when it comes to footwear. They don't gamble with comfort, traction, or stability. If a shoe doesn't perform, it disappears fast. Yet Clark's PEs didn't fade, they multiplied. According to sneaker analysts and league tracking data, these versions became some of the most worn shoes in the entire NBA, outperforming countless signature lines from established stars. What made it even more surprising was that these were Clark's signature shoes. They were limited, team-colored exclusives with her name attached, nothing more, but demand exploded anyway. Players reportedly requested them directly from Nike. Releases sold out within minutes. Resale prices spiked instantly. Screenshots of failed checkouts flooded sneaker forums as fans watched inventory vanish in real time. Inside Nike ***, this raised eyebrows. Because when NBA players the most visible basketball athletes on the planet, voluntarily choose a WNBA player's shoe over their own endorsements, it sends a message no marketing campaign can fake. This wasn't hype created by ads, it was credibility created by usage. And once Nike's internal reports reflected what fans were already seeing, one thing became clear: this wasn't a fluke. It was a signal. And signals like that force decisions, even if those decisions make people uncomfortable. At first, it was easy to dismiss what was happening as a momentary trend. Shoes catch fire online all the time, then cool off just as fast. But this didn't fade, it intensified, and once the data started stacking up, it became impossible to ignore. Inside Nike, teams closely track everything: wear rates across leagues, sell-through speed, restock frequency, resale premiums, and even how often a shoe appears in televised games. When the 2025 reports came in, they painted a picture that surprised even longtime executives. Caitlin Clark's play-exclusive shoes weren't just performing well. They were outperforming nearly every women's basketball product Nike had released in years. What made this so disruptive was the comparison it forced. At the same time Clark's PEs were selling out instantly, Ja Wilson's signature shoe sat widely available. No scarcity, no rush, no resale frenzy. According to sneaker market watchers, some retailers even saw repeated restocks without meaningful sell-through. That contrast wasn't subtle, it was glaring. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because accolades didn't explain the gap. Wilson's resume dwarfed Clark's in hardware and championships, yet consumer behavior told a completely different story. Fans weren't buying legacy, they were buying momentum, they were buying identity, and most importantly, they were buying into someone who felt connected to the broader basketball culture. Reports began circulating within sneaker circles that Nike had to manage allocation manually for Clark's PEs due to overwhelming demand. That kind of intervention is rare and usually reserved for the brand's most powerful signatures. Meanwhile, Wilson's shoe required no such oversight. Inventory wasn't the issue, interest was. This forced Nike into a quiet but critical realization: visibility was now more valuable than validation. The market wasn't reacting to who should be on top, it was reacting to who people wanted to see on top. And once a brand sees numbers like that, the conversation stops being emotional. It becomes strategic. And strategy, as many would soon find out, doesn't care who gets offended. Once the numbers became impossible to explain away, the conversation reportedly shifted behind closed doors, not publicly, not dramatically, but strategically. Brands don't announce pivots while they're still deciding if one is necessary. They test, observe, and slowly adjust, and according to industry chatter, that's exactly what started happening. Inside Nike, executives were now facing an awkward reality. On one side was a proven champion with an established resume and an active signature shoe. On the other was a younger player whose cultural gravity was pulling attention at a pace no one had projected this early. The safest move would have been to balance both, but balance becomes difficult when the market clearly favors one direction. Reports from sneaker insiders and marketing analysts suggested Nike began re-evaluating how resources were being distributed, not cutting ties, not making headlines, just quietly shifting emphasis. Campaign planning, long-term storytelling, future-facing investments, the kind of decisions that don't show up immediately but shape everything 6 months later. What complicated things further was timing. Launching another women's signature line too quickly risked internal competition. Nike had already invested heavily in a Ja Wilson's rollout, and stepping on that moment could have sparked backlash. So instead of rushing, Nike appeared to wait, to gather more data, to see whether Clark's momentum would level off or keep accelerating. It didn't slow down. As Clark's presence continued to grow across NBA broadcasts, sneaker culture, and mainstream sports media, the gap in attention widened. And attention, in today's market, is currency. Brands don't just sell products anymore, they sell narratives. And one narrative was unfolding organically, while the other required constant explanation. Online speculation intensified. Fans began connecting dots. Why did Clark's PEs feel more visible than an actual signature shoe? Why did Nike seem unusually quiet about future plans, yet unusually confident in long-term positioning? No official statements were made, no confirmations given, but the silence itself spoke volumes. Because when a brand like Nike stops explaining and starts observing, it usually means a decision is already forming. And once that decision leaks into public view, the reaction is rarely calm. The shift didn't explode overnight, it simmered. And as it did, the conversation slowly moved away from shoes and towards something far more sensitive: image. Publicly, nothing had changed. Nike stayed quiet, no announcements, no clarifications, but online, the contrast between the two athletes became harder to ignore. One was rarely seen addressing the noise, the other increasingly became part of it. A'ja Wilson began speaking more openly about recognition, media coverage, and what she believed was being overlooked. Some fans viewed it as justified frustration, others felt it came across as bitterness. Either way, the reaction was split, and for brands, division is dangerous. At the same time, Caitlin Clark continued doing the opposite. No public jabs, no commentary about deals or comparisons. She showed up, played, and disappeared again. Her visibility came not from statements, but from highlights, sold-out arenas, and NBA players wearing her shoes without being asked. That difference mattered more than many people realized. Modern sports marketing doesn't revolve around who speaks the loudest. It revolves around who creates the least friction. Brands don't just look at talent, they evaluate risk. How often will we need damage control? How often will we need to explain context? How often will a campaign shift from celebration to controversy? According to marketing analysts, this is where perception began tipping the scales, not because Wilson lacked accomplishments, but because every conversation around her seemed to come with tension attached. Meanwhile, Clark's presence felt neutral, even unifying. Fans projected onto her, media amplified her without resistance, and brands watched closely. Online discourse intensified, clips resurfaced, old quotes were re-examined, narratives hardened, and whether fair or not, a storyline began forming that Wilson was fighting the moment while Clark was becoming it. That's the danger zone for any athlete tied to a major brand, because once public perception locks in, reversing it takes years, not statements. And inside Nike, that growing gap between market response and public reaction raised a critical question no one wanted to answer out loud. What if the problem wasn't the product, but the story attached to it? And once that question exists, the fallout becomes inevitable. At some point, the debate stopped being about basketball skill, because skill was never the issue. What separated these two paths was something far less measurable: cultural gravity. A'ja Wilson had credentials few athletes in history could match: MVPs, titles, defensive dominance, international medals. In a traditional sports economy, that resume alone would guarantee top billing for a decade. But the modern sports landscape doesn't operate on tradition anymore. It runs on attention, identity, and emotional connection. That's where the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark wasn't marketed as a finished legend. She was marketed, often unintentionally, as a moment. Her game translated cleanly to highlight culture. Her range, confidence, and shot selection felt built for social media, not press releases. Fans didn't need to be told why she was exciting. They saw it instantly. Sneaker culture amplified this gap even further. Shoes don't sell on accomplishments alone. They sell on story, on chase, on whether people feel something when they see them. Clark's player exclusives felt rare, organic, and earned. Wilson's signature shoe, despite its quality, felt manufactured by comparison, heavily promoted, widely available, and disconnected from the broader basketball conversation. That difference shaped behavior. Fans didn't line up for what they were told to respect. They lined up for what felt alive. Marketing analysts often point to this exact scenario as the breaking point for many elite athletes. When dominance doesn't translate into desire, Brands have to ask a brutal question: are we building around greatness or relevance? Inside Nike, this distinction mattered more than public opinion. The company wasn't choosing sides emotionally, it was responding to signals, engagement, visibility, organic adoption, the things money can't manufacture. And once culture chooses a direction, fighting it becomes expensive and risky. That's when it became clear this wasn't about replacing one athlete with another. It was about recognizing that the game had changed, and the brand that failed to adapt would be left behind, no matter how decorated the player was. While all of this played out publicly, something far more important was happening quietly behind the scenes. Away from headlines, away from debates, away from speculation, this is where the story takes a sharp turn. Because long before the noise peaked, Caitlin Clark was already deep into a process most fans never see. According to interviews and podcast appearances, Clark wasn't handed a finished product and asked to stamp her name on it. She was embedded in development, testing, rejecting, tweaking, over and over again. The project that would eventually become her first signature shoe wasn't rushed. It stretched across multiple seasons, multiple prototypes, and countless on-court trials. What made this different from a typical signature rollout was intention. Clark reportedly pushed for performance before aesthetics, comfort before hype, function before flash. Nike engineers studied hours of her movement, how she plants, how she shoots, how she decelerates, how she changes direction. The shoe wasn't built for a demographic, it was built for her. Inside Nike, this required new approaches, new materials, new tooling, even new manufacturing processes. Industry insiders noted that elements of the shoe's cushioning and responsiveness hadn't appeared in any previous basketball model. Not men's, not women's. That alone signaled how serious the investment had become. Clark herself hinted that she refused to compromise. If the shoe didn't meet or exceed the performance level of the Kobes she already trusted, it wouldn't move forward. Period. That level of control is rarely given, especially to a young athlete, but Nike allowed it anyway. And that decision explains a lot. Because when NBA players were choosing her player exclusives over their own endorsements, they weren't reacting to marketing. They were reacting to feel, to responsiveness, to trust. The signature shoe wasn't designed to look revolutionary. It was designed to play that way. Which is why, by the time the public realized what Nike was building, the foundation was already set. This wasn't a gamble. It was a long-term bet, and one Nike clearly believed would redefine what a women's basketball signature could be. By the time the next phase became visible, the decision was no longer subtle. It was loud, just not in words. Nike didn't issue a press release announcing a shift. They didn't publicly compare athletes. They didn't explain anything. Instead, they did what major brands always do when they're confident in a direction. They invested. Reports and industry chatter pointed to Nike allocating top-tier marketing resources toward Clark's upcoming launch, the kind typically reserved for athletes who sit at the very top of the brand hierarchy. High-budget commercial concepts, cross-industry celebrity involvement, long-term storytelling instead of short-term promotion. This was the clearest signal yet. Because brands don't spend like that unless they expect returns, not just financially, but culturally. Nike wasn't preparing a shoe drop. They were preparing a moment, one designed to live beyond women's basketball and exist inside mainstream sports culture. Caitlin Clark fit that vision perfectly. Her appeal crossed leagues, age groups, and even sports. NBA players wore her shoes. Casual fans recognized her name. Younger audiences saw her as aspirational rather than polarizing. That kind of reach is rare and nearly impossible to manufacture. At the same time, speculation continued to grow about what this meant for A'ja Wilson. No official separation, no public fallout, but noticeably less visibility, less momentum, less energy behind what was once positioned as a flagship women's basketball product. To Nike, this wasn't personal, it was practical. Marketing experts often say brands chase clarity, confusion kills campaigns, and when one athlete's presence consistently created debate while another's created excitement, the choice became easier, even if it upset people. This wasn't about punishing Wilson, it was about minimizing friction. Because every campaign tied to controversy costs more explanation, more risk, more management. And when a brand has an alternative that generates attention without resistance, the math becomes simple. By the time fans started connecting the dots, Nike had already moved on to execution. And once execution begins at that level, there's no turning back. The brand had chosen its future, and the consequences of that choice were just beginning to surface. Once the direction was clear, the reaction was inevitable. Decisions made quietly behind closed doors don't stay quiet forever, especially when they involve billion-dollar brands and the most visible athletes in the sport. As online speculation intensified, attention shifted toward A'ja Wilson. Fans dissected her interviews, old clips resurfaced, social media threads framed her comments as frustration, entitlement, or something deeper, depending on who you asked. None of it was officially tied to Nike, but perception doesn't need confirmation to take hold. What made the situation more volatile was timing. Wilson had already spoken publicly about recognition, media narratives, and what she believed was being overlooked. In isolation, those comments might have passed quietly, but placed against the backdrop of Clark's rising visibility, they took on a different meaning. Online, the story quickly shifted from business decisions to personal reactions. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark continued doing exactly what she'd been doing all along: nothing. No responses, no subtweets, no clarification. Her absence from the conversation only amplified it. Every highlight, every sold-out release, every NBA player wearing her shoes added fuel without her saying a word. From a brand perspective, this is where things become irreversible. Companies don't just evaluate athletes on performance or popularity. They evaluate maintenance. How much effort does it take to keep a partnership clean? How often does messaging need to be corrected? How frequently does a campaign risk being hijacked by controversy? According to marketing analysts, this is where Wilson's situation reportedly became difficult, not because of one statement or one moment, but because of a pattern that made future campaigns unpredictable. Brands don't like unpredictability, especially not when they're investing 9 figures. Inside Nike, the contrast was stark. One athlete generated excitement without explanation. The other required constant context. And in modern marketing, context is expensive. By the time Wilson's frustration became visible to the public, the outcome had already been shaped by months of data, planning, and strategic alignment. The market had spoken first. Public reaction followed later. And once both move in the same direction, there's very little an athlete or a brand can do to reverse it. Because by then, the story isn't being told by statements anymore. It's being told by momentum. At this stage, the outcome wasn't driven by emotion, rivalry, or even controversy. It was driven by something far more decisive: risk assessment. For global brands like Nike, signing an athlete isn't just about how great they are. It's about how safely that greatness can be scaled. Every campaign, every appearance, every quote becomes part of a larger ecosystem. And when that ecosystem starts producing friction instead of momentum, executives pay attention. This is where the difference between talent and brand value becomes clear. A'ja Wilson never stopped being elite. That was never in question, but elite performance doesn't automatically translate into commercial clarity. Sponsors want predictability. They want narratives that uplift without explanation. They want ambassadors who make campaigns easier, not heavier. According to industry observers, Wilson's ongoing public commentary made that harder, not because her concerns were invalid, but because they introduced variables brands can't control. Every interview became a potential headline. Every statement risked being reframed online. and in a media cycle that rewards outrage, even neutral comments can spiral. On the other side was Caitlin Clark, whose approach removed variables instead of adding them. She didn't shape the narrative. She allowed the audience to. That gave brands something invaluable: flexibility. Campaigns could focus on performance, innovation, and inspiration without needing guardrails. Marketing strategists often say this is the tipping point. When two athletes generate similar visibility, the one who requires less explanation almost always wins, not because they're better, but because they're easier to build around at scale. And scale is everything. Nike wasn't deciding who deserved recognition. They were deciding where to place long-term capital, which story could last years without fracturing, which athlete could cross markets, cultures, and demographics without constant recalibration. By this point, the gap wasn't about shoes, statements, or stats. It was about sustainability. Because in modern sports business, the most valuable athlete isn't always the most dominant one. It's the one whose presence creates growth without resistance. And once that realization settles in, the decision becomes less controversial and more inevitable. In the end, this wasn't a story about who worked harder or who deserved more. It was about how modern sports actually function. Talent opens the door, but perception decides how long it stays open. Caitlin Clark didn't win this moment by speaking louder or demanding attention. She let the market choose for her, and the market chose clarity over conflict, momentum over tension, sustainability over noise. For brands like Nike, that choice wasn't emotional, it was inevitable.